Thanks everyone for joining us, the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome back to the show Nora Barrows-Friedman, who's an associate editor at Electronic Intifada and the co-host of their weekly live stream. Nora, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Eleanor.
Well, I'd say it's a pleasure, but it feels odd to use that word in conjunction with what we're talking about, but it's always wonderful to see you. I
Same.
wanted to start off with a recent report that you had posted on on Electronic Intifada called "Gaza has become a graveyard for children," which is quoting UNICEF. And we're recording this on December 15th for folks wondering because things change so rapidly and so grotesquely each day that if you're listening to this in a week, it might feel like we're behind the times. But basically what you were reporting there is North Gaza is being emptied of life in the most horrific ways. Those who are still alive are being forced into death marches, more towards the center of Gaza, which is, of course, also experiencing escalated bombings and attacks targeting children, which you mention in this piece called, again, Gaza has become a graveyard for children. So I was wondering if you could tell listeners what the situation is and what exactly the IDF is doing once they take over areas in either the north of Gaza or elsewhere in Gaza.
I mean, where to begin? We're now in the 15th month of this genocide. And in the past almost 11 weeks, um, the Israeli military has focused a large portion of its genocidal tactics on the very north of Gaza, so north of Gaza City. So areas like Jabalia, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia are being not just ethnically cleansed, but entirely decimated over and over and over again. No street, no house, no hospital is left alone. Many schools that have been turned into shelters over the last 14 months um, are being systematically emptied of families. uh, some families including many children, either by airstrikes directly upon these shelters or by surrounding these shelters, besieging them, sending in armed quadcopter drones, which is just another dystopian and now very normalized weapon that Israel has been using in Gaza, and ordering people, as you said, on these death marches to forcibly displace them to other areas of either Gaza City, where they're then again attacked, as happened last week, or pushing them even farther south to other areas that are also being attacked. And for the last 10 weeks in particular, I've been focusing on the situation at Kamal Adwan Hospital, which is pretty much the last remaining hospital in North Gaza, in Beit Lahia, where it was attacked before the beginning of October 2024, when Israel launched this focused siege of North Gaza, but especially after October of this year, a year into the attacks on Gaza, it has been relentlessly targeted by the Israeli military, not just with bombs, airstrikes, tank shelling, quadcopters, but deliberate and systematic targeting of hospital staff, of patients in their hospital beds, of displaced families sheltering in the courtyard of the hospital, and the director of the hospital himself, Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, was shot a few weeks ago He had like 6 different areas in his leg that were wounded by shrapnel, and he, he needed a vascular surgeon, to address his injuries, and there are none anymore left in Gaza, especially in North Gaza, where paramedics and civil defense forces, like firemen, EMTs, and physicians, are not even allowed into North Gaza. There is a huge checkpoint north of the Netzarim corridor that Israel has built, north of Nuseirat, kind of in central Gaza, and everything above Netzarim corridor is basically a killing zone, a concentration camp within a concentration camp. Not even, United Nations or any other international aid organizations are allowed into Gaza. No humanitarian aid has been allowed into Gaza, North Gaza, the last 10 weeks. And so the situation at Kamal Adwan Hospital has been just one of the most grotesque scenes of complete genocide, not just in the last 15 months, but I think in the last century. We haven't seen scenes like this of like systematic, relentless targeting of hospitals and patients who are already, either chronically ill or injured from other bombings. Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, the hospital's director, had to bury his son, who I think was under 10 years old, I think back in November, when Israel launched airstrikes on people in the hospital courtyard. He had to bury his own son in the courtyard. Colleagues of his have been assassinated while doing their work inside the hospital. He's had to bury them in the courtyard. It is just unspeakable what's happening in North Gaza. I mean, people are, there are only several reporters left as well, who have had targets on their back and are being hunted by the Israeli military as we speak. And they're the only ones getting these stories out. Food providers, what's left of that community of chefs and gardeners and agricultural workers are being assassinated. The head of the Gaza Soup Kitchen, which was this like lifeline of support for people in North Gaza and who was able to feed patients and medical staff at Kamal Adwan Hospital, was assassinated by a quadcopter drone about 2 weeks ago. Israel is targeting everything and everyone across Gaza, but especially in North Gaza right now, where they are, it is worse than anyone can imagine. Of course, all the footage that is coming out is only a fraction of what's actually happening, according to, everyone who, is left there. And the world is just shrugging its shoulders or not even looking. I mean, Gaza is hardly in the headlines anymore in corporate media. It is just, there are no words to describe what's happening there.
No, I know. It's I love words and they fail me daily.
Yeah.
And I so I've gotten this question several times and I feel like I know the answer, but I'm curious to hear how you answer it and your thoughts as you're much more the expert. The question that I get a lot is, well, why don't they just like if they're so desperate to rid Gaza of Palestinians, why not just remove them and then take over the land? And I'm curious what your response would be to that question.
I mean, that's what they're doing, in a sense. They're trying to break the will of the Palestinians who aren't, who, who aren't dead yet. They're trying to break um, people's ability to survive in every possible way, whether it is deliberately targeting their children, whether it is bombing their house, whether it is decimating the entire food system of the Gaza Strip. I mean, Israel has destroyed nearly 90% of all of the agricultural lands. Um, so they're trying to complete this genocide in the classic sense of extermination, of the final solution for Palestinians. Um, but that argument has always been there. I mean, since Israel began its settler colonial project in 1948, on the bones and the ruins of Palestinians and Palestinian villages, there was always this kind of assumption by Western actors that Palestinians uh, didn't really, have an attachment to that land, and Israel should just move them to Jordan or Egypt or wherever, and that would solve the issue. Which is, a classic, extremely racist and colonial vision um, of things. It's barbaric, and Palestinians are from Palestine. They've been there for millennia, since time immemorial. Um, there's it is repulsive to assume that Palestinians would rather live somewhere else than their own homeland. And it's their fault if they don't go, and then it's their fault if they get killed because they didn't move to allow space for European colonizers. And we see those arguments popping up again. You know, why don't they just surrender? Why don't Palestinians just go somewhere else? Um, I mean, those arguments are uh, they shouldn't even be given any oxygen. No one ever asked the Israelis to go back to, Europe, um, or North America, where they came from, or live as equal citizens in Palestine. No, I mean they don't. Israeli Zionism is an ideology that is predicated on, and I've said this many times before on your program, predicated on supremacy of one group over another. And because of Western settler colonialism, it is always assumed that Israelis have more of a right to live in Palestine than Palestinians do, and that Palestinians should be the one to accommodate Israeli settler colonial fantasies. Um, and and then if Palestinians don't capitulate to these repulsive settler demands, then it's their fault if they are killed in a drone strike. It's their fault if their hospital is burned to the ground. It's their fault if their children are in the crosshairs of an Israeli sniper. Um, and this is where we find ourselves today, where Palestinians are fighting for the right to remain in their homeland, and not just to remain, but to thrive in their homeland. And Israel and its U.S. partners um, are trying to eradicate that ambition that everyone in the world should be able to have. Um, and we're 14 months into this genocide, and Palestinians haven't backed down. Of course, they won't surrender. And Israel could have stopped this Israel could have had their captives back on October 8th, 2023. Um, that was the whole plan. And instead, they decided to enact a genocide because this was always the plan, to come up with an excuse. They never really needed one in the first place, to finally push Palestinians out of Palestine, and starting with Gaza, because Gaza has been the center of liberation struggle, for the last, almost 8 decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also in that question, there's also the not the recognition that people in Gaza can't even get out of Gaza to other parts of Palestine.
Right,
So
right,
the why don't you, I mean, I don't even like the question, why don't you leave when it comes to like parts of the US, like people in Appalachia, it's like you shouldn't have to leave. Like
right.
but I also think it speaks to this total lack. I mean, like that saying, a colonizer's every accusation is an admission.
Yeah,
And this suggestion that they wouldn't have a connection to land is just the colonizer admitting that they don't. So like, and you look at this anywhere, you look at Australia, for instance, the genocide against the Aboriginal peoples there was the same thing. Well, I just go to a different part, like you don't have a
right,
connection to this land.
right, right.
It's the same thing over and over again, regardless of the land that it's in. And now that we're kind of talking about the broader Palestine, I also wanted to ask you about the West Bank because Gaza gets understandably most of the attention in terms of alternative media and independent media, of course, nothing in corporate media, but the West Bank doesn't get as much.
Right.
But just recently, just in October, Israeli settlers destroyed some 700 olive trees.
Yeah.
You know, speaking of connection to land and lack thereof, could you talk about that extreme ramping up of violence in the West Bank as well, and how this is connected to what's happening in Gaza?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the settlers, have been on a rampage ever since last October. I mean, escalating from their usual rampages, over the last 7 decades, almost 8 decades. But yeah, in the West Bank, the settlers, as you mentioned, have been destroying olive groves. They have been torching Palestinian villages. They have been, really enacting pogroms and lynching attacks against Palestinians, supported, of course, by the Israeli army behind them. There has been increasing amounts of land grabs for settlements. So that is sanctioned by the Israeli government, of course, pushing Palestinians off their land, declaring it, Israeli state land or a closed military zone, and then building, either continuations of existing settlement colonies, on that land, or establishing new, what they called, outposts, for Jewish settlers. And also regular invasions and, sieges of, sites of Palestinian armed resistance in places like Jenin and Nablus and Tulkarem, these places which have, very active defense of their communities. And the Israeli plan was always, total control and total annihilation, of Palestinian areas anywhere in Palestine. So the plan for Gaza, they're saying when we're done with Gaza, we'll go to the West Bank next. And we're seeing that. I mean, policies haven't changed. They've just been more entrenched and expanded inside the West Bank. So we're seeing a lot more, land grabs, as I said, destruction. We're seeing, airstrikes on places like Jenin. We're seeing extrajudicial assassinations of resistance leaders, of, community members, of attacks on paramedics, attacks on hospitals, like they do in Gaza, but at a relatively lesser scale. And yeah, as you said, it doesn't get much attention. The you know, as people say it, the matrix of control in the occupied West Bank is so normalized. The apartheid system is so bureaucratic at this point. That it's not even really talked about anymore. It's been so entrenched over the last, especially over the last 50 years since the 67 occupation, that that yeah, that it gets overlooked. Meanwhile, the Israeli army is stepping up their control measures in Palestinian areas. It's taking more land. It's denying people work permits. It's doing invasions into towns, villages, and refugee camps. It's the number of Palestinians arrested by the Israeli military over the last 14 months in the West Bank has, I think, doubled. And that includes children as well. So we see, 12-year-old Palestinians being imprisoned and systematically tortured, held without charges, not given access to lawyers or family members, being thrown into what they call administrative detention, which is indefinite detention without charge, using secret evidence. These are all intentions to break the will of the Palestinian people in general, and to make life so completely miserable for every Palestinian that they just give up. The intention is that they'll just give up and leave and move somewhere else. So these are all genocidal tactics. It's, whether it's drone strikes or airstrikes or, a sniper, or whether it's administrative detention or the burning of olive trees or the, construction of new settlements. These are all genocidal policies. And of course, the United Nations agrees, the International Criminal Court agrees, the International Court of Justice agrees, but there has been no enforcement yet. So where do we go from here? I don't know the answer to that, and it's incredibly it's I don't even, yeah, again, like the words fail me. It's not frustrating. It fills people with a sense of just bottomless grief and rage to know that this Holocaust is being carried out day after day after day, for over 14 months. And the world watches.
Mhm. Yeah, it's soul breaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like the heartbreak came very early, and now it's just soul breaking.
Yes.
Um, and I wanted to ask, kind of still staying on the West Bank, but also just there's the language of apartheid and the language of genocide, and how people are forced into thinking that things are complicated when they're really not. And I think one of the examples of that is the Palestinian Authority, that confuses a lot of people like, well, that must be good, right? Oh, and if there's a Palestinian Authority that's Palestinian, then it can't really be apartheid, can it? Like, could you speak a little bit to the Palestinian Authority and how this kind of like double speak Orwellian language gives rise to people thinking that it's more complicated than it really is?
Right. Yeah, it's the same as the argument like, oh no, Israel can't be an apartheid state because there are Palestinians in the Knesset. So done and done. As though that argument is just totally, shut off.
Yeah, and I
With the
guess there are
Palestinian,
black people in Congress, so we can't
right.
possibly be racist, right?
No, exactly. Racism is over. There is no apartheid. Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of the Palestinian Authority, that was a product of the Oslo Accords in the mid 90s, where Palestinians were offered really a nominal kind of governing body apparatus under the condition, right, that the Palestinian Authority cannot defend Palestinians against Israelis. So Palestinians are unable to have a real kind of governmental defense force that would be what Palestinian Authority would maybe offer, and instead they have what most Palestinians see as really a subcontractor of the Israeli occupation. And it's not just hyperbole. Like when Israel is searching for somebody, let's say in Jenin refugee camp, and they can't find them, the Palestinian Authority police will find this wanted person, abduct them, and then literally hand them over to the Israelis at a checkpoint. This is a common practice. They call it security coordination. And the other role that the Palestinian Authority plays is to crack down on armed resistance factions inside the West Bank. And so you have the Palestinian Authority colluding with the Israeli military to assassinate members of, the armed wing of Hamas or PFLP or Islamic Jihad. And instead of protecting their own people from the occupier and the colonizer, they are, as I said, the subcontractor of the occupation itself. And so there has been, for years, there's been rising tension, obviously, between Palestinians who are suffering the brunt of Israeli occupation and the Palestinian Authority. And just in the last week, there have been direct confrontations between Palestinian armed resistance groups and the Palestinian Authority police. And many Palestinians will say that, it's only when the Palestinian Authority can be overthrown, and this like Vichy government, this comprador government, this not even really a government. I mean, it's it's bureaucratic in some ways, but how much bureaucracy can you have when everyone's inside a prison? That true liberation, the third Intifada, will really be when Palestinians can have a revolution over the Palestinian Authority and sever that security coordination tie between the comprador class in the West Bank and Israel. So it's a very volatile situation right now. My colleague Tamara Nassar just wrote a whole post on the Electronic Intifada about what's happening in the West Bank in terms of the Palestinian Authority. And it's, Palestinians have to fight on so many fronts, whether it's internally or defending themselves against the external forces of Israel and the United States. And that's kind of where we're at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned the Vichy government, which of course was the Nazi-controlled government in France. And while you were speaking, I also thought of the capos, which were the Jewish guards
Yeah.
inside of concentration camps. And again, like it's just that the same ideas just recycled in this extreme psychological torture that pits the oppressed against each other as opposed to the oppressor. And we only have a few minutes left, but I did want to talk about this because Syria is obviously something that has been, even in the corporate media, though of course in a completely, in a
Yeah.
completely warped way.
Yes.
The U.S. is cheering for the person that was on their most wanted list, the way that the U.S. does.
Yeah.
Um, but Israel has also taken advantage of this US-backed destabilization of Syria as part of the quote unquote greater Israel idea. And listeners, I'm not kidding when I say this. The Times of Israel literally had an op-ed talking about lebensraum. And if you don't know what that means, lebensraum was what the Nazis, it was a prime tenet of the Nazi platform and reason for invading various countries in Europe. To make Lebensraum translates to living room, to make space for the expansion of their master race. And this person in the Times of Israel was saying that that's what Israel needs is Lebensraum. So you could not even make this up. I don't know how
No.
the Onion stays in business these days because real news is that much more horrifyingly satirical. But with the time that we have left, Nora, could you talk a little bit about the Greater Israel idea and how that relates to Syria and whether you see this as a potential for Israel to crumble? Because how could you possibly keep up a war on so many fronts without getting some of the other countries in the region to respond?
Yeah. God. I mean, yeah, Israel has always had this Lebensraum, sort of platform itself. And it's not even ironic, I mean, it should be, but it's not, that they would even use that terminology. And I think actually that Times of Israel op-ed was taken down because so many people were like horrified at this like very mask off moment that Zionists have once again proved over and over again that Zionism is a supremacist ideology that has a lot of commonality with Nazi Germany ideology. Um, and so the reason they were talking, during the two months of war on South Lebanon, or Lebanon itself, but primarily focused on the South. Um, the past few months, they tried to invade. There were all these op-eds coming out from, top political Israeli leaders saying that we can't wait to also settle in South Lebanon. This is Greater Israel in practice. We're doing this. They couldn't step 10 feet into Lebanese territory without suffering immense casualties, and the risk to the Israeli military was too great, and because Hezbollah and the Lebanese armed resistance was able to defend Lebanon against a ground invasion, and Israel couldn't take the losses anymore, and left earlier this month. So there's the ceasefire. It's very uneven, of course. I mean, Israel still gets to keep bombing Lebanon as it keeps doing, and we'll see what happens with that in the coming month and a half. But in Syria, because as you said, the just openly colonial uh, uh, destabilization process, the de-sovereigntification, of Syria, led by the U.S. and NATO and Israel. Syria is now being carved up. Israel bombed more times in Syria in the first, week of this complete collapse of the Syrian government than it has ever in the history of its colony, ever bombed anything. And completely destroying the Syrian state's military defense infrastructure in order to really turn it into a client state that the U.S. and Israel can design as it likes. Israel has taken more land than it took already in 1967. So even more land than the Golan Heights. Israel is really carving up southern Syria, what's left of it. And again, I mean, there's Zionism is this like collision between this like fanatic religious, fundamentalist ideology, and that exploits Judaism for an imperialist ideology as well. So they'll placate the fanatics in the state government by saying this is part of greater Israel and this is whatever biblical something that they made up. And then, but at the same time, it's also a regional land grab and power grab and cash grab because, of course, Syria has a lot of resources and Israel wants them. And the U.S., of course, in partnership with Israel, can also partake in this grab. So this is incredibly dangerous for the entire region. And I hope, I mean, Israel, is economically, when you look at what's happening over the last 14 months, Israel cannot sustain this project of colonialism much longer. It is completely bankrupt. Its soldiers are either, being maimed, injured, or killed. We still don't actually know the numbers because Israel won't publish them. But it is, as you said, like it is being completely stretched militarily and economically. I mean, Israel is a garbage investment for companies now. It is high risk. It is low reward. Companies are fleeing. All these like tech companies that Israel was so proud of as the Silicon Wadi, as it called itself, the startup nation. All those tech companies are either going bankrupt or moving. And so hopefully this is a long war of attrition. And at the end, we might live to see the end of this colonial project. And that is because of the sustained resistance and the resilience of the Palestinian people. And and this determination for a liberation struggle that cannot be quelled. And so it's a really tumultuous time, to put it lightly. But people should be very skeptical about what they're hearing about Syria if it's coming from, of course, the corporate media and the weapons companies and those who are in cahoots with the colonial powers in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I always point people to the Electronic Intifada with regards to Palestinian issues. Is there somewhere where you'd recommend people look for reliable news on Syria?
Great question. There's Breakthrough News with Rania Khalek, also on YouTube. We've done what we can in terms of kind of basic Syria analysis from the perspective of the Palestinian struggle and an anti-imperialist kind of regional analysis. So you can also read about Syria on the Electronic Intifada. But I would seek out independent, skeptical journalists at this point. But yeah, Breakthrough is a good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Eugene has been on the show several times. We love him.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, he's amazing.
Nora, thank you so much for taking the time and giving people this information. Folks, please check out the Electronic Intifada. That's electronicintifada.net, where you can read all of Nora's work as well as her colleagues. You mentioned Tamara Nasser has just written a piece about the Palestinian Authority. There's so much information there and so much that we need to acknowledge and we need to look at. We cannot turn away. So, Nora, thanks so much again for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks. Anytime.